My name is Elena Vance. I'm 34 years old. And if there is one brutal truth I learned while navigating the treacherous waters of my childhood, it is this. In the Vance household, roles were assigned at birth, and they were non-negotiable. I was never the chosen one. That title belonged exclusively to my younger sister, Bella. To my parents, Mark and Susan, Bella was treated like some flawless treasure, a porcelain doll that had to be protected from the jagged edges of the real world. Her life seemed to come with a personal cheat code. I watched from the sidelines as she had her rent paid in full for luxury apartments she didn't appreciate, and her reckless credit card debts cleared without a single lecture. Meanwhile, every milestone I reached was brushed aside like dust on a mantle. For years, I kept my mouth shut. I worked double shifts. I built a career from the ground up without expecting a safety net. And yet, nothing I did ever matched the blind devotion my parents offered her. They defended her chaos, funded her whims, and rescued her from every disaster she engineered. I was just the daughter who was low maintenance. But last December proved something I never wanted to admit. They didn't just favor her. They believed they owned me. The explosion happened at a family dinner that was supposed to be a peaceful holiday gathering. All it took was one innocent question from my aunt to shatter the illusion. Suddenly, the air left the room. Bella stared at me with eyes that went from bored to predatory in a split second. My mother's face twisted into a mask of pure indignation, as if my success was a personal insult to their struggle. When the truth about my secret $38 million deal finally slipped out, the reaction wasn't pride, it was war. Bella dropped to the floor, wailing theatrically, demanding I write her a check for $12 million on the spot. My mother started screaming that I was selfish, insisting I owed the golden child a fair share of my life's work. If you want to know how a single sentence turned a quiet evening into the moment I finally decided to cut ties forever, stay with me until the very end. Trust me, this one gets unbelievable. Before I unravel the legal nightmare that followed, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button so you don't miss the details of how I fought back. Long before I had a bank account or a driver's license, I understood the invisible architecture of our home. It wasn't written in a rule book or discussed over Sunday pancakes. Yet, it dictated every breath we took. My sister, Bella Vance, was the sun, and I was just a minor planet expected to stay in a quiet, distant orbit. Mark and Susan never explicitly stated they preferred her. They didn't have to. The family budget and the emotional energy in the room did the talking for them. Bella's desires weren't treated like requests. They were treated like urgent mandates. If she needed top-tier equipment for a gymnastics phase that lasted 3 weeks, the credit card came out. If she wanted to quit piano because the teacher didn't get her vibe, my mother was on the phone firing the instructor within the hour. Meanwhile, I learned that anything I wanted had to be debated, and anything I needed had to be earned. I wasn't told to explore my passions like Bella was. I was told to be reasonable, a phrase my father used so often it felt like my middle name. Whenever Bella faced a minor inconvenience, a chipped nail, or a forgotten permission slip, it was treated like a massive household emergency. My parents would drop everything to fix it. But when I struggled, it was framed as a character-building opportunity. It didn't matter if Bella actually deserved the spotlight. She occupied the role of the golden child so naturally that challenging it felt like fighting gravity. I cataloged the differences in a mental ledger. If I brought home an A on a difficult history exam, I got a distracted good job. If Bella brought home a C- but tried her best, we went out for a celebratory pizza. When I started a new hobby, the question was, is this going to cost money? When she started one, the question was, how can we support your dreams? Even as kids, the hierarchy was unmistakable. She got the window seat. I got the middle. She got the last cookie. I got the lecture on sharing. I became the silent problem solver, the one who stopped asking because silence was less painful than rejection. I don't remember hating her back then. I remember watching her move through life with the terrifying confidence of someone who has never had to justify your existence. She walked through our home like she owned the floorboards, while I learned to walk on my toes. Our Aunt Tessa was the glitch in the matrix. She was the only one who ever looked at me with a knowing expression, a gaze that lingered a second too long, as if she wanted to apologize for a crime she didn't commit. She never openly fought the system, but her eyes held a validation I didn't get from Mark or Susan. That look was my only proof that I wasn't crazy. As we grew older, the imbalance didn't shrink. It calcified. My parents acted like catering to Bella was a law of nature. And every time I adapted, every time I swallowed a complaint, the dynamic tightened. By the time I turned 18, the roles were set in stone. Growing up this way didn't make me bitter immediately. It made me self-reliant. But deep down, a quiet realization took root. If I ever wanted a life that was truly mine, I would have to build it from scratch, because no one was coming to save me. Adulthood didn't arrive with a celebration or a key to the city. It arrived with a U-Haul truck and a profound sense of relief. The moment I turned 18, the distance between my reality and the Vance family fantasy widened into a canyon. I moved out the second I had saved enough from waitressing to cover a deposit on a studio apartment that smelled faintly of old coffee and damp drywall. But it was mine. No one could walk in and demand I change the channel or clean up a mess I didn't make. For the first time, my thoughts didn't have to navigate a minefield of someone else's moods. College wasn't the party scene everyone talked about. It was a grind of 6 a.m. alarms, stale sandwiches, and textbooks bought used online. I enrolled at the local community college because it was the only safety net I could afford to weave for myself. Every dollar had a name and a purpose. I taped a budget to my fridge that was so strict, buying a latte felt like a reckless splurge. Structure was my lifeline. While my world revolved around making rent and keeping my GPA up, Bella's path unfolded like a VIP experience. My parents secured her a gorgeous 2-bedroom apartment near campus, fully furnished, with utilities covered. They called it setting her up for success. When she switched majors from psychology to fashion merchandising because the reading was too heavy, they applauded her for finding her true calling. She had the freedom to fail, restart, and fail again without ever feeling the ground shake beneath her feet. I knew she wasn't maliciously taking resources from me, but she certainly never questioned why the faucet only poured in her direction. That part stung more than the struggle itself. She accepted every bailout as if it were her birthright. Meanwhile, every decision I made required a risk assessment. A flat tire meant skipping a grocery trip. During those years, I worked multiple jobs to survive. I was a barista in the morning, a tutor in the afternoon, and eventually, a night shift logistics coordinator at a massive distribution center. The warehouse job paid better, and that was the only reason I stayed, even when exhaustion clung to me like a second skin. Some nights, I'd stare at the blinking cursor on my screen at 3 a.m., wondering how other people slept 8 hours a night. But pushing through that period did something crucial. It taught me how to function without a cushion, how to solve problems when there was no one to call. Independence wasn't a choice anymore. It was a survival strategy. My parents rarely asked how I was managing. Their calls were brief check-ins, usually pivoting to updates about Bella's latest drama or triumph. She was always finding herself, and apparently, finding oneself was an expensive hobby. I listened, nodded, and offered vague congratulations because arguing would only get me labeled difficult. As time passed, the contrast became laughable. I graduated with student loans I'd be paying off for a decade. She graduated debt-free. I moved into a slightly larger apartment that still required a roommate. She moved into a condo my parents co-signed for. They called it a smart investment. I called it another chapter in a book I was tired of reading. Despite everything, I didn't resent the silence between us. If anything, I craved it. Building a life on my own terms gave me a strange kind of peace. Every setback taught me resilience, and every small win felt earned in a way nothing from childhood ever had. The further I drifted from their orbit, the more I realized that being alone wasn't the same as being lonely. It was freedom. As the years shifted, a new clarity formed in the quiet parts of my routine. It didn't arrive through a sudden inspiration, but through long nights at the warehouse, watching shipments move in patterns the rest of the staff barely noticed. I became fixated on the inefficiencies, delays, misplaced items, outdated tracking systems that forced workers to rely on patchwork solutions. Something about the chaos felt fixable, and the idea followed me home each night until it settled into something larger than curiosity. I didn't have funding, connections, or family support, but I had discipline that became the backbone of everything I built. Afterward, I started teaching myself basic coding after work using free tutorials and a borrowed textbook. The learning curve was steep, but each concept pushed me forward. I treated every small milestone like proof that I could turn this interest into something tangible. Eventually, I created a simple prototype, a bare-bones system that could streamline internal routing. It wasn't impressive to anyone else, but to me, it was a doorway. I tested it relentlessly, adjusting functions, rewriting sections, documenting every bug. My apartment became a hybrid of workspace and storage unit, and the glow of my laptop stayed on long after the building fell silent. During that period, I made a deliberate decision. I wouldn't tell my family anything. Their pattern was predictable. If they knew what I was doing, they would ignore it until it benefited them. If it succeeded, they would treat it as a family asset. And if it failed, it would become evidence that I'd never been as capable as Bella. Silence felt safer. While my days were shaped around progress, theirs were still shaped around my sister. My parents kept praising her ambitions, even when those ambitions changed every few months. She drifted between job prospects without urgency because she knew the safety net beneath her would always hold. I watched from afar as she received temporary support that lasted years. My mother described her as finding herself, a phrase I learned to interpret as still waiting for someone else to solve things. Meanwhile, I registered my company, VanStream Solutions, LLC, and began pitching a functional version of my system to small businesses. Some rejected me. Some didn't understand the value, but a few listened. A small distribution center became my first client, and the moment they agreed to implement the system, something inside me shifted. It wasn't pride. It was validation, the rare kind that comes from earning ground no one offered you before. The workload became overwhelming quickly. I balanced freelance contracts during the day with system development deep into the night. My bank account fluctuated in uncomfortable ways, but the progress felt worth every sacrifice. There were moments I questioned whether the effort would ever amount to anything, but giving up never entered the equation. Too much of my life had been spent proving I could handle things alone. Quitting would have meant accepting the narrative my parents had always painted for me. As the company expanded, I began reaching levels of responsibility I never imagined. I hired my first contractor, then a second. I secured a modest office space on the outskirts of town, just big enough for 2 desks and a whiteboard covered in deadlines. I learned negotiations, invoicing, investor meeting skills no one had prepared me for. Each challenge became another layer of armor. Throughout all of it, I remained invisible to my family. They assumed my life moved in quiet, predictable lines. Each time I visited, the conversation revolved around Bella's next plan, next expense, next reinvention. The distance between us was no longer emotional. It was structural. They didn't ask questions about my work, and I didn't offer answers. It was easier that way. Silence prevented expectations, assumptions, and intrusions. Growth didn't feel triumphant. It felt steady, earned, and private. As momentum gathered around VanStream Solutions, the pace of my life shifted into something I could barely recognize. The quiet structure I once relied on evolved into a relentless cycle of meetings, revisions, and decisions that carried weight I never anticipated. The company no longer felt like a side project. It had grown into a functioning machine fueled by expectation and potential. Each step forward demanded a new level of precision, and I adapted because adaptation had always been my default. Eventually, investors began approaching with interest that felt more serious than any pitch I had ever received. I met with each one cautiously, testing their intentions, evaluating whether their goals aligned with the integrity of the product. Success didn't feel like pride yet, but it felt tangible, something I could trace back to every night spent working through exhaustion. The acquisition talks began quietly. A mid-sized tech group requested a demo, then requested financials, then scheduled follow-up meetings that lasted hours. Every document I handed over represented years of discipline condensed into numbers and graphs. I kept my emotions controlled, not out of indifference, but because the possibility of something this large didn't feel real enough to celebrate. When the offer finally arrived, I reread the email several times to make sure I hadn't misunderstood it. They valued the company at $38 million and wanted to finalize within the quarter. The contract wasn't a surprise after the negotiations, but the number still felt surreal. I signed it alone in my office, surrounded by empty coffee cups and notes scribbled during late hours when I wasn't sure any of this would ever amount to more than an idea. There was no announcement, no triumphant call, no celebration. I saved a copy of the signed agreement, closed my laptop, and sat in silence as the weight of the moment settled into something complicated. I had never expected applause, but the absence of it felt sharper than I wanted to admit. Keeping it private wasn't a strategic choice. It was instinct. Everything in my upbringing had taught me that anything of value could be twisted into obligation if shared prematurely, so I said nothing. Not to Mark or Susan, not to Bella, not even to relatives who tended to treat information like currency. The success was mine, and for once, I wanted something in my life to remain untouched by the gravity of family dynamics. During that same period, my parents continued shaping their lives around whatever Bella needed. They refinanced part of their home to help her through what they called a transitional period. They covered bills she forgot to pay and praised her for working on stability, even when stability meant moving from one short-lived job to another. Their support was unwavering, and she accepted it without hesitation. I didn't resent the pattern. I had learned long ago that their choices had nothing to do with merit. They saw Bella through a lens that had been polished since childhood, and they saw me through a lens shaped by expectation rather than promise. Nothing I accomplished shifted their perspective, and I stopped wishing it would. As December approached, my Aunt Tessa asked if I planned to attend the annual holiday dinner. She sounded genuinely curious, not probing. I told her I'd be there, and in her pause, I could hear a hint of something. Maybe concern, maybe anticipation. She didn't know the details of the acquisition, but she knew I had been building something substantial. For reasons I couldn't explain, she was the only person whose reaction I didn't worry about. The night of the dinner, I drove to my parents' house with no intention of revealing anything. My goal was simple: show up, stay polite, avoid conflict, and leave early if things became uncomfortable. I didn't expect anything unusual to happen. I didn't expect questions I couldn't sidestep. And I definitely didn't expect the evening to shift in a direction that would unravel every remaining thread connecting me to that household. Walking up to the door, I felt none of the warmth typically associated with holidays, only a faint uncertainty about how the night might unfold. Stepping inside the house that evening felt strangely familiar, yet distant enough that I could sense how much I'd changed since the last time all of us shared a room. The decorations were already up, arranged with the same precision Susan always insisted on, and the usual noise of holiday chatter filled the background. Nothing about the environment hinted at the shift that would soon divide everything along a new fault line. I moved through the rooms with practiced caution, quietly acknowledging relatives and offering polite smiles, careful not to linger long enough for anyone to press for details about my life. Most interactions were surface level, and I preferred it that way. Avoiding attention had become second nature, especially in settings that revolved around old roles I no longer fit into. Dinner began with the predictable rhythm plates being passed, questions directed toward familiar topics, and plenty of praise for whatever updates Bella shared about her current plans. I listened without comment, recognizing the dynamic as one I had learned to navigate long ago. The evening could have continued that way without disruption, if not for the one person who had always seen more than the rest. Aunt Tessa waited until the table settled before turning her attention toward me. She didn't raise her voice or make a show of it. She simply asked how my work had been going, phrasing the question with a tone that held more knowledge than curiosity. Her timing was deliberate, and in that brief silence after her words, I sensed the room shift. Eyes started turning in my direction, not with interest, but with surprise that anyone had asked me something that required more than a quick answer. I felt the weight of the moment pressing against my chest, and for the first time that evening, there was no quiet route to escape. Holding back the truth felt heavier than letting it surface. I didn't offer details, only the core fact that I had finalized the sale of my company. I stated the number 38 million without embellishment, keeping my voice steady, not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because I refused to disguise the work behind it. The table fell into a silence so complete it felt unnatural. Every expression around me shifted, not gradually, but with abrupt certainty, as if each person needed a moment to confirm they'd heard correctly. Shock hit first, then disbelief, and then something far sharper. The atmosphere tightened in a way that didn't require words to interpret. My mother's posture changed, rigid and cold, carrying a tension I recognized from years of unspoken expectations. My father froze completely. But the most jarring shift came from Bella. The expression she wore wasn't confusion or curiosity, it was a kind of panic that came from seeing a world she relied on tilt dangerously out of place. Her reaction built quickly. The quiet shock dissolved into visible agitation, her breathing unsteady as the number settled into something she couldn't rationalize. I could feel the energy around her collapsing, as if the stability she'd always assumed was now slipping through her fingers. The entitlement that had followed her since childhood didn't vanish. It surged. The realization that I had built something so substantial without their awareness scraped against the narrative Bella had always lived inside. The tone of the room shifted further when judgment replaced silence. Expressions hardened. Questions formed behind narrowed eyes. None of it needed to be spoken aloud for me to understand the accusations gathering around me. They weren't impressed. They weren't proud. They were incredulous that something significant had occurred without their permission, involvement, or benefit. What unsettled them wasn't the success itself. It was the independence behind it. The idea that I had built a future that didn't pass through their approval threatened the structure they'd upheld for years. My sister's distress deepened as she processed the implications, and the tension spreading across the table made it clear that every unspoken assumption in our family had been abruptly overturned. Their reactions were not about the number I'd said. They were about what that number meant in a household that had never expected me to matter. What followed did not explode all at once. It unfolded in quiet stages, the way a crack spreads through glass long before it finally shatters. Life went back to something that looked normal from the outside. But underneath, there was a constant sense that something was moving just out of sight, pulling at the edges of whatever was left between me and that house. The first sign came in the form of a bank alert from my primary institution. It was the kind of message I normally skimmed and deleted, but this one held numbers that did not belong to any plan I had made. Large transfers had been attempted from accounts linked to my name toward a destination I did not recognize. None of them had gone through, but they were close enough to feel like someone breathing on the back of my neck. When I called to verify the activity, the details they were allowed to share lined up with information only a narrow circle could have known. Security questions I had never given to anyone else had been answered correctly. Contact information connected to my parents' address appeared in the access log. No one at the bank said the word, but the implication sat there between the lines. Someone with intimate access to my history had tried to turn that knowledge into opportunity. The realization did not arrive as a sharp burst of anger. It came as a slow, sinking heaviness, like discovering that the floor of a house you once trusted had been hollow for years. I had always understood that my family felt entitled to my time, my attention, and my emotional labor. Seeing evidence that they felt entitled to my money down to the level of passwords and accounts changed something fundamental in me. Self-preservation became less of an idea and more of a duty. I reached out to Harper, the attorney I had been referred to months earlier but never fully engaged. Sitting across from her in a quiet office, I laid out everything I knew: what the bank had flagged, the long history of financial favoritism toward Bella, and the pattern of pressure that had intensified since my success became visible. She listened without flinching, then began outlining the steps needed to protect what I had built. Through Harper, I brought Ben into the picture to untangle the financial threads. He built a clear record of how much support had flowed toward Bella over the years, how often Mark and Susan had stepped in to absorb her mistakes, and how completely my own path had been separate from that safety net. Seeing the numbers lined up on paper made the imbalance impossible to frame as imagination or sensitivity. It was structure, it was proof. Marcus handled the technical side, gathering logs and documentation from the bank with proper authorization. He traced connection points back to devices and locations that matched my parents' routines. Nothing about his work relied on emotion. It was timelines, access points, and consistent patterns. The more he uncovered, the harder it became for me to pretend any of this could be written off as confusion or a harmless misunderstanding. With those pieces in place, Harper moved things out of the realm of family tension and into formal legal action. Letters went out. Restrictions were placed on who could contact my financial institutions. Claims were filed that forced Mark, Susan, and Bella to respond in writing instead of behind my back. The tone of their messages shifted from moral pressure to defensive explanations. The moment they realized there were consequences beyond my discomfort, the impact reached further than they expected. Their accounts drew scrutiny. Their attempts to move money raised questions they could not easily answer. Credit lines tightened. People they were used to impressing began to hear a version of events that did not match the story they had tried to tell about a selfish daughter withholding her share. Reputation, once treated as a shield, became another thing that could crack. Bella felt the shift sharply. Without easy access to new funding, she could no longer treat obligations as suggestions. The house payments that had once been cushioned became heavy. The car that had seemed like a symbol of status turned into a financial burden she could not carry. Selling things she once took for granted was not revenge from my side. It was a natural outcome of living without someone else's resources, quietly filling the gaps. As all of this moved forward, I made quieter changes of my own. I moved to a different place, one that carried no shared history and no expectation that I would drop by out of habit. I tightened my circle to people who saw me as a person, not as a reservoir to draw from. I put more of my energy into work that mattered to me, mentoring others, supporting projects that aligned with the values I had carved out on my own. Cutting contact was not a single moment. It was a series of choices, ignoring calls, letting messages go unanswered, blocking channels that had once been open by default. There was grief in that, but it was the kind that comes from finally admitting a truth you have resisted for too long. I was not walking away from a loving support system. I was stepping out of a structure that had always required me to shrink so someone else could feel big. Looking back, what happened with the money is almost the least important part of the story. The real fracture came from realizing just how quickly people who claimed to love me could justify crossing every line when they believed they were owed something. The attempts to reach into my accounts were not just about greed, they were about entitlement. The moment that control slipped, they chose violation over respect. If there is anything I want someone listening to this to take away, it is this. Shared blood with someone does not mean you owe them access to your future. Support is earned through respect, not demanded through guilt. Boundaries are not betrayals. They are the only way to protect what you fought to build when no one else believed you would build anything at all. I did not cut ties because I stopped caring. I cut ties because caring had turned into a weapon in their hands, and I refused to let them use it to claim a life that was never theirs to touch.